Minute for everybody to come in, for everybody to mute themselves and get settled.
Sì, dai,
Um, and then we
faccio
will
vedere
kick it
io
off.
adesso.
Thank you all for making the time and for joining us today. It's good to see so many of you online. So I think because we have so much material to cover, I'll go ahead and we can get started. I'm going to pass first to our council member, Micah Lawrence Galati, to give us a welcome before we dive in to the presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kate, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Micah Llorens Gulati, and I represent District 1 in our City Council. And very briefly, I just wanted to express the commitment on behalf of the Mayor and the Council, City Council, for this issue that we have in our community, sea level rise. It is one of our top priorities, and about 2 years ago, our commitment was to hire our wonderful Kate Hageman, who was our previous speaker. And we've been working on this plan for the last 2 years. So huge gratitude to our staff, our partners, and our community. This is an issue that we need everybody on board to solve. So I really look forward to the presentation of the report of the last 2 years and also to the feedback from the community. Thank you so much.
Great, and thank you so much for your leadership. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and hopefully that goes smoothly. Again, I'll introduce myself. My name is Kate. I work at the City of San Rafael. Been working on the sea level rise study and the sea level rise work for the past few years. So as mentioned, our project is a large collaborative project. By no means, it will be a struggle for me to name all of our partners because we've been so lucky to have so many involved. But Canal Alliance has been a leader on this with us, as well as the Multicultural Center of Marin, UC Berkeley, the county, as well as the city, and so many other partners as well. Canal Arts, Exploratorium, Y Plan. Again, I will forget to name everybody because we've been so fortunate to have so many people involved. And also a thank you to our funders, the Marin Community Foundation, the State Coastal Conservancy, and the Governor's Office of Policy and Research, or the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation. Before I go further, I neglected to mention that si quisiera escuchar esta presentación en español, tenemos interpretación. Puede click the button that says interpretación por debajo y tenemos un cuarto en español. And if you need any help with the interpretation, just let us know and we can help get you connected. So, as mentioned, over the past few years, our partners, Canal Alliance, Multicultural Center, and many others have hosted a number of events, radio programs, focus groups, workshops. We've had a variety of community science events, field trips, lots of partnerships with our teachers, University Prep program. We've had University of California, Berkeley students, local Laurel Dell students, many, many people involved. And we have also had the leadership of a steering committee, is now called the Sea Level Rise Working Group, as well as our technical advisory committee, the Consejo de Residentes, Voces del Canal, and many, many others. So we wanted to say a huge thank you for each one of those pictures. There's 5 or 6 people involved, and it's been a tremendous amount of work that's been going on over the past several years. So over that time frame, we've had more than 145 events on sea level rise. So more than 5,000 people engaged directly through those events. And then thanks to the coverage that we've had on the media, reached more than 300,000 people through media. But if you were one of those people who is saying, how could you have had 150 events and I didn't know this was going on in my community? We absolutely understand. We have over 16,000 people that live in this area that's vulnerable. So we've reached some, but by no means all. And so I just want to reassure folks that might be joining for the first time today, or that most of the work that we've done, or much of it, has been recorded, and we have a lot of great resources if you want to get caught up. Our partners at the Multicultural Center of Marin have done a great radio program series that's all online if you want to learn about how this issue intersects with housing, how this issue, the science of it, how it intersects with emergency preparedness, community health. A lot of great material is recorded and available online. We also have, again, thanks to our colleagues in the press, a lot of great stories that help us, kind of tell an overview from the Chronicle to KQED recently, Telemundo, and others. So a lot of those press stories are also a great overview if you want to get caught up. One of the things that we have been doing in the course of this outreach is that we know that addressing this issue is a really long-term challenge, and it's going to take investment and programs and many efforts over the coming years to decades. And so through the course of the engagement, our colleagues at Canal Alliance and the Multicultural Center have been really listening out to hear what are the main priorities that we've heard from the community around this issue, and synthesize those into these guiding principles. And the intention is that these principles can help guide the many years of investment, many types of programs that will be coming in the years to come. So most importantly, protecting people, preventing displacement, connecting people, community leadership, environmental justice, and protecting our ecosystems and connecting to nature are the themes and the principles that we have heard the most over the past several years. The other important place to pause is that Andy, our colleague, will review the long-term adaptation options or that are available to prepare in this community. And we know that unfortunately, those kind of projects take years to decades to build, and we have a risk right now. And so the community has also shared with the city council and with us that they would like us to take action now to address those risks. And so those priorities kind of coalesce around these short-term priorities to prepare for an emergency now, to protect existing residents and businesses when we build or when we rebuild, to do so in a way that accounts for flooding, so that we're not building new bridges that flood just after they're constructed, and committing to environmental justice. So we at the city have tried to incorporate these into our 3-year plan, but these are areas where we're going to focus our work, and have been focusing our work, so that we can keep moving ahead and keep making people safer while we address these longer term challenges. And Andy, let me also say too that if you are, again, one of those people that's newer to the project and haven't had a chance to share your priorities, we have a survey that is open, and we welcome and encourage you to put your questions, your thoughts, your experiences in here so that we can integrate your priorities as well into our work moving forward. I'll also say that by no means is this last 2 years the first 2 years of addressing this issue. Many of you have worked on previous projects as well, professionally and personally. This has been an issue in San Rafael for quite a while, and we have a number of studies that have documented very clearly that this area is one of the most at risk in the whole Bay Area. In this study that Andy is going to present, we've tried to focus more on looking at how can we respond? How feasible are those options? What are the implications? How much will they cost? How much space would they need? What are the trade-offs in terms of housing or the environment? What would we really need if we wanted to go down this path? And the reason that we're focused on that is because in this context, we really don't have a simple answer or clear-cut easy choice. Otherwise, it would have been done before. We have some difficult considerations, and so we wanted to use this time, this study, to gather that information to form the basis of a community conversation about the best way to move forward. Just say really quickly, sorry, that design and construction will come in the years ahead, but they're not what we're talking about right now. In this study, while we may be talking about different adaptation measures, we're not intending right now to construct them. We're looking at several options and understanding them. Because we have a very, very dense, very vibrant community, and we have a very, very close relationship with the water. In this case, there isn't a right answer. We have hired experts, and they'll share their information and their opinions, and that's really valuable. But I think as will become clear, having that information doesn't necessarily point us to a single right answer. In this case, we don't really have a single answer. It's going to take many different types of actions over many years and by many different people. And at this point, we have to consider kind of the whole community. We have more than 10,000 people that live on land lower than the bay. Lots of jobs, lots of infrastructure, healthcare, schools, really, really precious places to us, as well as the highway, wastewater treatment plants. So even if you don't live in this area directly, we're all affected by these impacts. So we're using this information to help us make a more informed choice about a path forward that can help create a more thriving community in the generations to come. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get ready to introduce my colleague, Andy Sternad. We're really lucky to have a very broad team who has been supporting this study with a lot of expertise, both directly in their communities and in communities all around the country that are in the world that are dealing with these issues. So Andy will present their work, and then I'll take it back for questions and talking about next steps. So I'd encourage everybody, if you haven't already, feel free to add your questions to the chat throughout. And if you have any that are top of mind before we even start, please go ahead and use the chat and we'll keep an eye on that. So without further ado, Andy, thank you so much.
Right. Thank you, Kate. Let me get my screen shared. Kate, if you could just give me a thumbs up when you're seeing that.
Yeah, it looks good, Andy. Thank you.
Great. Um, so thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Andy Sternad. I'm a principal at Wagner and Ball, a design studio within Moffitt and Nichol. I'm the project manager for the consultant team, a really much larger team, though, with CMG Landscape Architects based in San Francisco, ESA, SFEI, and even Deltares from the Netherlands. So this has been a much larger effort in partnership with all the community partners Kate mentioned. Wanted to just begin with a brief acknowledgement of the Coast Miwok people who stewarded this land for generations, and we're grateful for that. Very briefly, I would like to just review existing conditions, many of which we're all familiar with here, and then get into the adaptation alternatives. We are experiencing king tides already that in some cases exceed the predicted lunar tides due to storm surge and other factors. The highest tide from 2024 was 8.37 feet. Here you see some photos of impacts there, even overtopping at some of the lowest parts of the shoreline edge. And most recently, just earlier this month, a tide of 8.7 with over almost a foot and a half worth of storm surge on top of the predicted tide. These are tipping points. We're already seeing these overtopping impacts, but they're at the threshold of much larger impacts, overtopping and potentially compromising larger segments of the shoreline. So it's a very important moment. These risks are present today, and even higher tides could be seen in any given year. There's a statistical probability of much larger events any given year. But there's definitely a trend. The reason this is so critical in San Rafael, high water, is because of the basin condition. All the area in purple is below high tides today. And that area expands over time as sea level rises. So there's a great real estate value and large number of people at risk below existing high tides, protected by a very thin shoreline, and in some cases, very informal defense. The land is already low. The land is low because it's sunk and it's still sinking. Much of that low basin condition is built on former baylands that have been filled over time, primarily in the 20th century. And so that former San Rafael Creek that flowed out through marshes is now constrained through the city. And the land surrounding it, built on those unstable bay soils, is compacting and sinking. And the rates, anywhere from a quarter inch to 2 inches per year, depending on where you measure, the rates tend to get worse the farther out towards the bay you go, and the more recent the fill, that land was filled. But the land is still sinking, and that's putting further strain and risk on the coastal protection system. The shoreline itself is also low and unstable. It's not continuous around that low basin, and in many cases, it's very informal or unstable. Literally sometimes piled debris. The king tides we've seen recently, in many cases along the canal shoreline and the bayfront, are within inches of overtopping some of those areas. And in some cases on the bayfront and canal have already overtopped in the recent king tides. Kate mentioned the large population at risk. That population is projected to grow. The risk is projected to grow over time as sea level rise increases the probability of high water events in the bay and canal. And San Rafael is in the Bay Area, the most populous, population dense place outside of downtown San Francisco, just to give you a point of reference. The shoreline today has very limited space in general and many private owners. This is a really not an advisable condition. Where coastal flood risk exists, we typically like to see public ownership and public accountability for that continuous edge, rather than relying on individual owners to maintain that edge. So there are many private properties on both sides of the canal that put everyone living behind them potentially at risk if their shoreline is not maintained and elevated over time. So this is a fundamental challenge that space to adapt is hard to come by, especially within the canal shoreline area. So all of these risks are covered in a briefing book and with additional resources online, including the feasibility report itself. You can find those at the city's website. So briefly, a recap of the risks and vulnerabilities as well. What are we looking at today and in the future? There's a probability of high water any given year at water levels even higher than we've seen recently, and even higher than we've seen in the past few decades. All of that water that either falls by rainfall or overtops within the basin is dependent upon pumps. So that risk of overtopping and flood based on overtopping grows each year as sea level rises. We've done some stormwater modeling, which I'll show you in a moment, on a no action scenario. What happens if sea level rises at a certain rate, or tides are reached at certain elevations with no action on the shoreline, independent of rainfall? And the model indicates a real tipping point between 8 and 9 feet, similar to the king tides we've just seen, where impacts rise dramatically based on what we've seen historically. As we look ahead to 2050 and anticipate about a foot of sea level rise based on current projections, that likelihood of that tipping point event occurring on an annual basis becomes greater and greater. So for a point of reference, we think about annual probability in the 1% range as a level of safety. That's about a 100-year storm. And that's the typical design elevation for coastal protection systems around the country, especially those based on Army Corps standards. So really, we're looking at the 1%, which hardly even shows up on a graph like this. These events are becoming much more probable. And so the time to act really is right now. I mentioned the pump stations in the basin, that it's not only the level of water that's reached, it's the time to drain that it overtops. So when we hit that tipping point between 8 and 9 feet, we're looking at about 3 hours to drain some areas of that basin condition. When we get to 9 feet and above, we're looking at 21 hours and greater to drain one tide cycle. And these high tides often happen back to back. Another risk faced today, not unique to San Rafael around the bay, but especially so here, is earthquakes, seismic risk. There's a liquefaction risk on those filled bay soils. There's also a risk of earthquake destabilizing the informal flood protection and levees that exist today. So the buildings inside are vulnerable as well. In some cases, soft story risks. So we can talk about that more in a moment when we get to alternatives. Critical assets finally within the basin are at risk. These are things like fire stations, stormwater and wastewater pump stations, and community centers. One of the things we're seeing, the nature of that risk has to do with access as much as risk to the structures themselves. So fire stations, the Boro Community Center, for example, may stay dry during most tidal events that we can expect to see. However, the access to and from those locations may be compromised, too deep to drive through, in some cases too deep for fire trucks to drive through. So if people need to get to those locations in emergencies, or if first responders need to get out, they may have trouble doing so. The pump stations as well may essentially be recirculating the bay if water gets high enough, as we saw at the Montecito pump station just earlier this month. So what are the alternatives and what are their implications? We modeled 3 alternatives. We also modeled a no action or a baseline scenario. That's only for comparison. That's not to say that we won't take action. We also modeled a series of initial actions, and these are no regrets ideas, putting safety first that can happen immediately, that can underpin all alternatives. And finally, we looked at a suite of nature-based opportunities. These also go across all alternatives and have a variety of benefits, for wave attenuation to reduction in tidal amplification. So it's really a hybrid approach, integrating green and gray alternatives together to develop these 3 scenarios. A lot of these concepts have been previously proposed, some from the Army Corps dating back decades to more recent efforts. So really what we're trying to do is not recommend one of these alternatives, but present them equally together for comparison. And this is ultimately something that will have to be decided based on community conversation and by folks locally on the ground. We're trying to get, within these shorthand names of 3 alternatives, we're trying to capture a comprehensive systemic approach 3 different ways and compare the implications across them. Just a quick view of the no action alternative. What would it look like at different tidal thresholds with the shoreline today? These are scenarios with no rainfall, with all the pumps functional, and without yet accounting for future subsidence or projecting forward subsidence rates. So this is really a snapshot of today. It's also a model, so there's a coarseness to it. It's a hydrologic model. So there may be some inaccuracies, of course, in any model. But I think it's indicative of the trend and some of the recent events we've seen on the ground. So an 8-foot tide observed today would begin to overtop some of the very lowest portions of the canal and threaten those informal areas of the shoreline. Potentially starting to fill back along Francisco, and you can see that in the model. At a 9-foot, as we approach that tipping point around 9 feet, you see the impacts grow and the potential overtopping locations expand throughout low areas of the canal, especially on the south shoreline, and right at about 9 feet, approaching 9 feet in areas of the bayfront shoreline, the very lowest areas of bayfront. As we look to a 10-foot tide, that overtopping expands. Those overtopped locations of the current shoreline expand, and we get to potentially 3 to 4 feet of flood depth in widespread areas within that basin. This is also a threshold point where we may start to see impacts on 101. And again, these higher water levels have a statistical probability of being observed any year. That means they could occur any year. This is not a future condition. They just become more likely over time. The highest event we modeled was an 11-foot tide, where there's widespread overtopping throughout the district. And these are the conditions with multiple days to drain those areas based on the pump station capacity today, once the water recedes. We also start to see impacts kind of creeping up towards downtown and in the creeks entering the San Rafael Creek around the highway. So that's a no action snapshot. Initial actions that were framed are around some of those community priorities, including immediate safety, piloting of nature-based features that can influence future decision making, and thinking about no regrets. What are the features we could put in place today that will buy us time for bigger transformations and adaptations in any scenario? Within the canal, uh, those initial actions look like raising and stabilizing those lowest, most vulnerable areas, developing emergency response plans. We may also begin an evaluation, potentially begin an evaluation of public acquisitions of the most vulnerable areas, or at least easements on those privately held parcels. In the Bayfront, this is go ahead and potentially beginning design for the Bayfront levee, implementing the Tiscornia marsh restoration, and monitoring additional habitat measures. Again, these are all proposed ideas. None of this is set in stone. And finally, basin and upland. Within that low-lying basin and upland behind it, we need to maintain and upgrade the pump stations. Those are critical for drainage, for overtopping and stormwater drainage in this area. And think about green infrastructure, things we can do for stormwater management within the basin and upland that reduce the pressure on those pump stations from rain. It's also important green infrastructure can help mitigate some of the subsidence and groundwater issues we see. Nature-based opportunities, just a snapshot of what some things that may exist in habitat types around San Rafael, the San Rafael OLU. We identified a range of nature-based opportunities on the canal shoreline, on the bayfront and upland that may be part of any of the alternatives. Things like protection of the existing baylands, enhancing rocky tidal habitat, thinking about nearshore reefs and the value of oyster reefs and wave mitigation. Coarse beaches, there are some that already exist along the San Rafael levee. How could those potentially be sustained and expanded? And more. Managed marshes, and all the way up to things like implementing habitat on vertical surfaces and bulkheads. So there really is green and nature-based opportunity everywhere throughout all the alternatives. It's a matter of selecting these features and integrating them into design moving forward. So the first alternative, raised edges. This is a concept essentially to protect in place structures and infrastructure that are there, and strategically insert higher seawalls, offshore and onshore seawalls, and raised levees where we can. So this alternative on the bayfront looks like primarily a raised levee working from the existing shoreline in and up. Within the canal, on the south bank of the canal shoreline, these are low seawalls, sheet pile seawalls, some onshore, some offshore. On the north bank of the canal and upstream in the creeks, that strategy continues around by San Rafael High School, for example. And then elsewhere on the north bank of the canal and elsewhere around the bay are individual structure raising and access adaptations, along with raised roads to maintain connectivity. So the priority here is really to develop a contiguous raised edge at a standardized elevation around that low basin area and provide adaptation for safe access to structures elsewhere. So what might that look like? Just a quick view for the bayfront. Strategies may look similar to what's there around the Spinnaker Lagoons, for example, and around Tiscornia Marsh. Providing opportunities for restored and protected marsh habitats, providing opportunities for a raised bay trail. In some cases, this is a few inches, all the way up to a couple of feet to get to a standard threshold of protection, a 100-year threshold of protection, 2050. Along the canal shoreline, we can look at examples around San Francisco Bay. Down in Foster City, it may be a flood wall, a sheet pile flood wall that's capped, could exist onshore. Offshore, we may be looking at something like a cantilevered seawall. You can see an example of this in the breakwater at Treasure Island, of a freestanding structure within the water. In the canal case, there would be water on both sides, except in the highest water levels when the land side would be protected. So those structures are really working in and around, where possible, what's there today. We're not fundamentally proposing to change the pattern of ownership around the canal or around San Rafael. Alternative 2 is a canal gate. This would be a navigable structure, gate structure at the mouth of the canal with very similar adaptations elsewhere along the bayfront, raised roads, raised levees. Important to note in the canal gate option, this isn't kind of a one and done. There would potentially still need to be adaptations behind the gate on the shoreline to limit the number of times that gate would operate. And we'll talk about that again in a moment. Also important to note in this alternative would be a forward pump station associated with that gate at the mouth of the canal. This pump station would be quite large, approximately 3,000 CFS. That's around at least an order of magnitude larger than the largest pump station in San Rafael today. And so we'd be managing all of the water that comes down San Rafael Creek when it's raining. All of the basin area and all of the upland area draining through the creek would have to be managed in the event that gate were closed. Examples of what gates may look like. From a sector gate, here's an example from New Orleans on the left. This is an operable navigable gate. Smaller gates like tide gates can exist in other places. One exists, for example, in Lake Merritt in Oakland. Those are not navigable and manage water in different ways. We'll talk about some of the implications of this gate for water quality and other things in the interior behind it in just a moment. And finally, alternative 3, this is incremental elevation and redevelopment. The bayfront condition would look similar to the previous 2 alternatives, a raised strengthened levee. Within the canal shoreline itself, this is a larger redevelopment strategy between the first public right-of-way or street and the canal edge along the south shore and wrapping around towards San Rafael High School on the north. And then the similar raised road and structure strategy elsewhere on the north shoreline. This is potentially the longest term. It may take the longest and may be the most expensive. On the other hand, may provide benefits that others don't long term. This is the only proposed alternative the only alternative that was evaluated that really makes space and makes new space for the types of flood protection infrastructure that are seen elsewhere around San Rafael and the bay within the canal. So the feasibility analysis of these alternatives was multifaceted. We looked at a range of criteria from flood protection to timelines to space requirements, permitting, all the way down to ownership, housing, ecological implications, economic implications. They all have advantages and disadvantages. We'll go through these briefly in summary. For flood protection, looking ahead to 2050, the goal is to reach that 100-year level of protection. That's a 1% chance of overtopping with 1 foot of freeboard and assuming 1 foot of sea level rise. The alternatives 1 and 2 more easily reach these timelines. Alternative 3 may still have gaps because you need 100% participation to establish that contiguous shoreline. In the near term, in alternative 2, the gate may be expected to close around monthly by 2050. And so those interior shoreline adaptations for those lowest areas of the canal shoreline may still need to occur. That's assuming there is still some level of modification, those initial actions that modify the lowest and weakest points. So it's not only a strategy that happens at the mouth. As we look farther ahead to 2070, 2100 and beyond, all the alternatives require some type of further adaptation. The raised edge scenario requires, alternative 1, requires further adaptation both for the canal shorelines and at the bayfront, additional elevation and lifts. The canal gate may be closing more often at this point, potentially up to daily, depending on modifications made to the canal shoreline behind it. Eventually, as we start to see a sea level rise at 5 or 6 feet, that structure may need to close permanently with implications for water quality and other things, navigability behind the gate. Long-term, an additional bayfront levee lift is required for alternatives 2 and 3. And then finally, alternative 3 in the 2100 timeframe, we reach those levels if the full alternative, when the full alternative is implemented. So further adaptation may not be necessary within the shoreline of the canal in this alternative. It can last potentially a generation or more. Thinking about planning horizons, all of the alternatives take years, sometimes decades. This requires securing funding, in some cases securing land, design and engineering, permitting, and then construction itself. So these are all long-term. What we're really trying to do with the initial actions is buy time. So stabilize the lowest areas of the canal and bayfront shorelines to give us a little more time to implement larger adaptations. Alternative 1 may take somewhere between 10 and 30 years to build. We evaluated a fast and a slow scenario for each alternative and then an average. So what's represented visually is the average to the right. You see the funding, design, and permitting, then you see the effective protection in dark green, and then future adaptations moving past that. Alternative 1, if it's in the slower, in the average and slower timeframes, there's a potential gap in protection if the whole alternative is not put in place in time. It's dependent on a contiguous whole. For alternative 2, the canal gate may be slightly faster to build. There's less linear area affected, and the canal gate itself may function for longer. To make such an investment, it's wise to use a higher elevation or higher threshold for the gate itself. So the gate may function for 2070, 2100 levels. It can be built to function that way as at first, but the bayfront may need to be further elevated in lifts over time. And finally, alternative 3, the incremental elevation option may take the longest to build, 20 to 40 years. So average, we're thinking about potentially completion around the 2060 timeframe, which leaves that potential protection gap, basically perpetuating the no action scenario until this alternative would be complete. But once complete, potentially stable for longer term. Spatial requirement comparison, looking at length of the levee and seawall condition, length of raised roads, and then overall building impacts. And those building impacts range from floodproofing in place, potentially wet and dry floodproofing where applicable, to structures in place, to reconstruction. You see the longest option in terms of length of levee and seawall is the raised edge, alternative 1. The shortest option is the canal gate, which makes sense. We're not necessarily dealing with all of the shoreline behind it, although that may need to be done to some level. The raised road, the shortest length of raised road, as well as the canal gate, but you'll see an asterisk all the way through. These do not include potential adaptations that may need to take place for the canal shoreline. And then building impacts, the gate has the fewest, touches the fewest existing structures. However, again, that does not include the canal shoreline adaptations behind. So while alternative 3 touches the most structures and area, around 82 acres, just over 80 acres within the canal shoreline itself, as you compare it to the other 2, you may need to revise or combine those alternatives in a way as far as building impacts, because there would be impacts for the canal shoreline within the gate alternative. But these impacts are really essential to establish public ownership and the space for public ownership, whether through easements or acquisitions at the water's edge, in order to protect that low basin condition behind. As far as permitting impacts, alternatives 1 and 2 may see some mitigation needed for in-water construction impacts, and especially alternative 2 for additional habitat impacts near the canal mouth, for the structure itself and for that forward pump station. The alignment intention is to avoid the restored Tiscornia Marsh but there may be adjacent impacts to sensitive habitats for those large structures. Alternative 3 proposes no limited or no in-water construction, and so no in-water impacts. And permitting would rely more heavily on the city and BCDC for more intensive adaptations on land. All of the alternatives require an environmental impact report moving forward and potential engagement with a multitude of agencies. Land ownership would be primarily the same as we see today for alternatives 1 and 2. We would maintain most of the shoreline ownership with the exception of easements and public acquisitions of certain parcels or parts of parcels where necessary. And sometimes that's for maintenance access, sometimes depending on funding source. For example, if the Army Corps or certain other federal sources are used, the land must be public for these types of structures and interventions. Alternative 3 is really the only alternative that increases public access and connections, increases the possibility for public ownership of those protected shorelines, protecting the basin condition, and it provides opportunities for public-private partnerships. That area for redevelopment between the street and the shoreline, however it may be acquired in order to initiate the redevelopment, there may be opportunity to, through public-private partnerships, to capture some return on investment and to really reimagine what the canal shoreline is today. As far as co-benefits, alternatives 1 and 2 are really focused on maintaining the structures and status quo. So there's limited co-benefits. These are trying to find space where we can, but not really changing the paradigm or changing the way the shoreline looks or is managed today, especially within the canal. Alternative 3 is really the only one that provides additional co-benefits, extending the Bay Trail through the canal shoreline, possibly new housing through redevelopment, such as the public-private partnership, and possibly making space for other aspirational infrastructure like a pedestrian bridge to connect over to San Rafael High School and across the canal. On the bayfront, all alternatives look about the same. The strategy is roughly similar. They provide opportunities to expand habitat, expand public access down to the water in some locations, and to make the Bay Trail more flood resilient throughout. Housing implications, alternative 1 and 2 may have some temporary or indirect displacement potential. This is due to construction, but also due to indirect displacement that sometimes results from investments of this kind for public protection. They both protect in place most existing structures. However, the waterfront views may be more affected in alternative 1 along the canal, and in some areas, more specific areas around the gate itself in alternative 2. For alternative 3, there would potentially be some permanent displacement as a larger area is redeveloped, elevated and redeveloped along the canal shoreline. But there may be a possibility to reconstruct more housing units that are lost eventually over time, and that would require a strategy for those impacted today. It also provides an opportunity to remediate some of the soft story earthquake risk for those vulnerable structures near the water today. Ecological implications, the alternative 1, really the opportunity here is for vertical seawall habitat, but there's not much space for anything else within the canal. Alternative 2 within the canal has possible construction and operational impacts. These include things like turbidity impacts, noise and vibration, habitat impacts, air and water quality from the operation of the gate and the forward pump station. Alternative 3 within the canal really provides the opportunity to make space. So if we can allocate and hold space for more habitat and for water quality improvements, that's where we can see potentially the most benefit. It's the most transformative in terms of space. On the bayfront, there's, as I already mentioned, a variety of nature-based opportunities, all up and down, at key locations up and down the shoreline, the bayfront shoreline. Habitat and ecological improvements are, for the most part, not protecting from overtopping, from still water overtopping of that bayfront edge. But in combination with other types of infrastructure, they can provide benefits like wave attenuation, reduction of tidal amplification, at the same time as habitat enhancement. And finally, what does it cost? What is the economic feasibility? A high-level cost comparison, you see in the first column, alternative 2, the gate, would appear to be the least first cost alternative. That's for the gate itself and the bayfront adaptations. But a big asterisk there, that's not including potential adaptations behind the gate. If the gate needs to close more frequently and ultimately permanently, there may be even more mitigation costs to address the impacts within San Rafael Creek. So there's a big asterisk there. The alternative 3 is the most expensive by far, but it's also the most transformative. And the number here, 1.8 billion, rough cost, does not include the redevelopment value, the cost to actually rebuild housing units or the potential real estate return on investment. That's the only alternative 3 is the only alternative that provides potentially a return on investment for new development directly associated with flood protection. As far as annual operations and maintenance, the most expensive is the gate. The least expensive is raised edges, basically static structures with the exception of a few places where water is moving through that offshore seawall. And that's calculated as just an annual percentage of construction cost. That's every year. It's important to note the city would also need to set up, in some cases, new organizational structures to manage this infrastructure. And then damage avoided, alternative 3 has the greatest damages avoided, but that's also because it's built to a higher standard. It's a more transformative adaptation. So it's protecting from higher water levels longer. Finally, in summary, and before I hand it back to Kate for next steps, just looking across the alternatives, raised edges, well possible, and potentially the fastest. These are seawalls within the canal and raised levees at the bay. Maybe may have the least impact in some ways, but the fewest co-benefits in others. The risk of displacement is relatively low compared to the other alternatives, but those co-benefits and what we're getting for that structure is also relatively low. The canal gate, well, intuitively may seem like a simple solution to close the mouth. There's a lot of complexity introduced in operating that gate. There's that big question mark, that big asterisk of what may need to be adapted behind the gate in order to limit the frequency of operations. So they're also potentially the fastest to construct, potentially easier to shorter to construct this alternative, but with low co-benefits relatively speaking. Finally, alternative 3 takes significantly longer to fully implement, just because the area and the number of properties that we're talking about in this alternative. So the property complexity is quite high. Displacement risk is also the highest for those properties low lying along the canal shoreline, especially the south bank of the canal shoreline. And although the initial cost is high, the co-benefits also potentially are the highest for this alternative, for access, for future housing, and for the environment, if we can reserve space for those things within a broader transformation. So with that, I will hand this back to Kate, talk about next steps and questions.
Great. And Andy, actually, if you don't mind just leaving your slides up for 1 second, we had a couple of questions. We have had a lot of great questions come in, and I apologize, we won't have time to get to all of them right now on this webinar, but we will try and follow up after. But Andy, if you don't mind, I might just ask a couple of the questions that have come in. So one question is, when you talk about public versus private ownership, that's a difficult question. It could be a webinar in and of itself, but do you mind just saying again, in a typical situation like New Orleans, how is public ownership part of the mix?
In most cases around the world that I'm aware of, areas with a basin like San Rafael have publicly owned shorelines. that means that whether it's a park or a levee or an easement across private property, it's property that's in the public domain, that's maintained by a public entity, and that really has to do with risk. If you have any private owner that with the basin condition behind them, even if their property itself is not is higher and maybe not, and their building may not be vulnerable to flooding, if that shoreline fails in a high water event and water overtops at their property and floods behind, they may be potentially liable uh, for the maintenance of that shoreline and the risk therefore behind it. And so, really, it's a way. It's more typical for the public to shoulder that risk in these kinds of conditions. It also allows for a much more cohesive operations and maintenance regime along that edge, and in general, just a higher factor of safety.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Andy. And maybe just for those that aren't as familiar, the situation that we have in San Rafael right now, when Andy says the basin condition, we have a large area, including the Highway 580 and other places where the land is lower than the high tides, but it's not flooding every day because individual owners, yards, gardens, businesses are blocking the water. And so if we have an owner or private property where say they dig a trench on the side of their building, which has happened, and the bay starts to flow in. That's on private property. So it's not necessarily, at the moment, we don't have public engineers or public staff that would go out and maintain or inspect the shoreline to make sure that it's safe. Right now, that responsibility lies with all of the private owners that own those segments of the shoreline, which is kind of an unusual situation. Andy, do you mind also just explaining a little bit more when we talk about, for example, option two or option one, where we have a barrier around the whole community? How does that work as a system? Maybe just expanding a little bit more on the different components that are part of that system.
Yeah, that's a great question. And given the nature of this basin with land lower than the bay, um, it's essential to manage the edge as a system. That includes for protecting from overtopping, but it also includes managing stormwater and groundwater that may occur within that basin. So we need to think systemically about the flows of water all around, whether it's rainfall, groundwater, or bay water and tides, because they all function together. There are different aspects of water management and risk occurring from those flows of water on both sides of the edge. And so, really, the only way to ensure safety is to think about the way that all this infrastructure works together. So it's not just a single line at the edge. Really, we're looking for multiple lines, ideally, or multiple lines of defense, not just one. In some ways, pump stations function as a multiple line of defense, helping to keep things dry. But where possible, we're trying not to rely on just one structure. It's many things working together to provide that factor of safety.
Yeah, and Andy, you brought up one of the other questions that we had, which you mentioned, but maybe you could just mention again. Could you talk about the pumps themselves? Why couldn't we just use the pumps maybe to help us prepare for this? What are the limitations of the pumps that we have right now?
The pump system right now is designed for rainfall events of a certain scale, not for bay water, not for overtopping of the edge for the most part. So the pumps are not designed for the volume of overtopping we may see any given year, but especially in the future. Some of these high water events, they aren't really designed for salt water, and you need a higher edge to pump against. You know, if you're in a bathtub, you need an edge to pump over it to get the water out. Otherwise, you're just recirculating water from within the bay, which happened earlier this month in some cases. Um, so we really need an edge, and then we need the pumps to help maintain it. This is the way that infrastructure supports a city lower than water. It's how infrastructure is set up in New Orleans, in the Netherlands, and some other parts of the Delta north of the Bay.
Yeah. Andy, do you mind going back to the cost slide really quickly? Understandably, we have a lot of questions about how much will this cost? who is going to pay for it? What's included in these costs? And I'll say, maybe before putting Andy on the spot about their study, the big picture takeaway is that really addressing these challenges in a systemic way that provides that level of safety for everyone living in this area or working or passing through this area is an expensive proposition. There have been other studies before this that have also underscored how expensive this is, but that is kind of one of the main challenges that we have here. So one question that came in was, could the city of San Rafael take on one of these alternatives and pay for it locally? All of these options currently exceed our ability to pay for them 100% locally. There is the potential to get state and federal funding and external funding, and certainly any project of this scale would be pursuing it. And any project getting external funding from state or federal sources will likely also still need a local contribution. Sometimes that's 25 or 35%. So in this study, we didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of how could this be paid for, who could pay for it. We're getting the rough order of magnitude of what the scale is. And that's why we're gathering this information to be the foundation for the community conversation about how, which path we want to choose, which path we would move forward with. So that was a long ramble, but Andy, do you mind just answering a little bit more about what question came in about alternative two? It says if the alternative two also includes potentially one and three, how come it's shown as the least expensive here?
That's a good question. Its alternative two is costed for the elements unique to that alternative. So it would be possible to protect that basin area with the bayfront adaptations and a gate for extreme high water events like a king tide. It may be feasibly possible to do that. So that's why the cost stops with those elements. Thinking holistically as a system, though, and for everyday tides and increasingly high everyday tides over time, more would need to be done behind the gate so that it's not closing essentially daily or permanently. So there's a livability component to that was separate from what was costed for protection of those extreme events. And it's important to make decisions based on the livability and the function on a daily basis moving forward. But we wanted to find a little bit of apples to apples comparison for that extreme high water protection. That answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know we're almost at the top of the hour, so we'll take the other questions in for consideration and hopefully can get back to you individually. But with that, I just say a huge thank you to Andy, Dilip, ESA, Patricia. There were so many people that were involved in this study, and we really thank you so much for all of your work. And then so many of you involved online as part of the technical advisory committee or the steering committee or many other ways that you've contributed to it. So yeah, John, our volunteer MVP, Gail, many of you have been at just dozens of events. So thank you so much. I just wanted to mention a few next steps. One next step is that if you'd like to see this presentation again, we'll be doing it again this evening in Spanish. You can join us in person at the Wellness Center on Kerner, or you can join us online via Facebook at Canal Alliance's Facebook Live. The event this evening will be in Spanish online, or if you would like English interpretation, you can come in person. We'll have all this information posted on our adaptation webpage. You can also share your reactions and your priorities in the survey link that I posted and is also on that webpage. I want to just mention briefly in terms of next steps. We have many next steps. Of course, this is just one step in a long journey. If you would like to be more involved, we have several formal planning opportunities coming up, including the East San Rafael specific plan, which many of you are involved in. At the community level, we still have our steering committee, our working group will continue, and that's a space for continued involvement, as well as Nuestro Canal, Nuestro Futuro, and shaping the community vision process as part of that. Also, formally, the city and our community will need to create a regional shoreline adaptation plan. So deciding on our path forward, and that will be coming up as well. So, and in the short term, we'll be working here locally to integrate some of the recommendations and programs that are in the general plan and making sure that those are in the code and doing what we can on those short-term priorities of rebuilding and building safer, emergency preparedness, climate justice. And I'm forgetting the fourth one, but the work is ongoing. If your community, your homeowners association, or your neighborhood would like this presentation again, or would like to talk about how it affects your community, myself and my colleague Corey are available to do that. So just reach out to us and we'll keep the conversation going. So with that, just say a huge thank you. Corey, is there anything else that you wanted to add or that I forgot to say before we sign off?
Only that, we'll keep updating the webpage. It's a great resource and we'll continue to make it as best resource as we possibly can. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much for joining. Great to see you all. Appreciate it.